The engine sat on the bench, stripped to its bones, pistons out, crankshaft gleaming like something alive. Rodrik Banks stood over it with blackened hands and tired eyes, brushing his thumb across the exhaust valve with a kind of reverence. He knew every bolt in a Merlin like it was part of him. The whine it made at 25,000 feet, the metallic hiss when it cooled after a long flight, and more importantly, he knew its secrets, the ones even Rolls-Royce didn't put in the manuals. RAF Marham, in 1943, was a blur of noise and pressure. Mosquitoes lined the dispersal like silent wasps waiting to sting, sleek and fast, but lately, not fast enough. Crews were returning with holes in their wings. One bloke, Donnie, came back white-faced, said he'd seen the oxygen mask of a 109 pilot in his mirror. That close? Too bloody close. Rodrik listened, standing outside the hangar during those debriefings. Never spoke, just filed the fear away with everything else. He was a fitter. Nothing glamorous. A man who made engines work and signed logbooks when they did. Orders came from above, but lately, the orders weren't good enough. The Merlins were strong, yes, beautifully built, but they weren't breathing hard enough. "Rod," called Sergeant Lister one afternoon, leaning on a tool chest. "You going to help me strip this Magneto, or just admire it to death?" Banks didn't reply. He was staring at a data sheet, one he'd read 100 times before. Boost pressure limits, detonation curves, material tolerances, Rod? Lister frowned. "You all right?" Banks looked up slowly. "What if we're not giving her everything she can take?" "Who?" "The Merlin." Lister raised a brow. "She's got a manual, mate. We don't guess with Merlins." "I'm not guessing." Banks dropped the sheet and grabbed a pencil. "I'm reading between the lines." He started small. One engine. One test. A slight tweak to the boost control unit. A spring that let the pressure climb a little higher before shutting down. Then a richer fuel mix. Not much, just enough to cool the combustion chamber. No orders, no approvals. Just quiet work, late at night. On the test rig, the engine howled louder. Hotter, yes, but controlled. Then came the biggest gamble. "Peter," Banks said one evening, cornering squadron leader Channer outside the mess. "I've made a few adjustments to your girl." Channer turned, squinting. "Adjustments? You'll get 15, maybe 20 extra knots, maybe more. And if I don't, you'll blow your guts all over France." Channer laughed, the kind of sharp, tired laugh only pilots had. "Hell of a sales pitch, Banks. I need to know if it works." Channer studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we'll see what she's got." The next morning, DZ-414 rolled onto the runway like every other Mosquito. But inside, behind those twin Merlins, was a war crime of engineering, and Peter Channer was about to commit it. Takeoff was smooth, climb steady. Then, at altitude, Channer pushed the throttles, past the stops, into the red. The engines screamed. The airspeed climbed. 370, 380, 390. It kept going. His navigator swore. "What in God's name have you done?" Channer grinned, sweat streaking down his face. "We're faster than the bloody fighters now." Over the Ruhr Valley, they ran into a pair of FW-190s, standard playbook. The Germans dove from above, guns hot. But the Mosquito didn't play by those rules anymore. Channer pushed the override. The Merlins didn't choke. They roared. The gap widened. The 190s fell back, outpaced by a plywood ghost. Back at Marham, Channer landed shaking, grinning like a lunatic. "I don't know what you did, Banks," he said, stepping down, "but you just rewrote the bloody rules." Word spread. Fast, pilots came with whispers. "Could you make mine like Channer's?" Ground crews offered whiskey for secrets. Banks said little. He just kept working. The Air Ministry would have had a fit if they knew. Rolls-Royce would have screamed. But the crews coming home alive? They didn't care about regulations. They cared about 20 extra miles per hour. They cared about living. The next weeks turned into something strange at RAF Marham. Not official, not spoken aloud, but real as steel. Rodrik Banks found himself working not just on Merlins anymore. He was working on requests. Pilots were quietly pointing to their aircraft. Her, they'd say. Make her like DZ-414. And Banks, quiet and tired-eyed, would nod. He wasn't writing any of it down. Not the real stuff. In the logs, it said, routine carburetor inspection, fuel mixture balance adjusted, boost governor calibrated. All neat lies, paperwork for safety. The truth lived in the fingers of the men who flew and the knuckles of the men who turned the spanners. But even Banks had limits. He couldn't tune all of them himself. So he started watching, not for rank. For understanding, Thomas Yardley was one, a young lad from Glasgow, fresh out of Hillington, who could hear an engine idle and tell you which cylinder was running lean. Banks handed him a spanner one night and said, "Watch this." They worked in silence for an hour. Then Yardley repeated the process. Exactly. Banks asked one question. Why? Yardley answered like a man who knew, not just guessed. He was in. By March 1943, 3 more Mosquitoes had the touch. None looked different. But when they rolled out, the ground crews nodded to each other with knowing looks. These were Banks birds. They'd scream when you opened the throttles, and God help the German who tried to keep up. The test was always the same. Survival. And the proof kept coming. On April 19th, Squadron Leader Channer ran a photo recon mission over Gelsenkirchen. The Germans were waiting. 2 FW-190s vectored in from Münster. Angles perfect. Altitudes sharp. Channer didn't flinch. He let them close. At 6 miles, he said calmly to his navigator, "Let's see if she can dance." He shoved the throttles past the détentes. The Merlins leapt. The gauges surged past red. The Mosquito bucked, then surged like something alive. They dropped altitude slightly, trading height for raw speed. The fighters tried to keep up for 30 seconds. Then, slowly, inevitably, the gap grew. 500 yards, 800, a mile. The Germans peeled away, throttles wide open, engines howling with rage and futility. Back at Marham, Channer touched down smooth as silk. One of the riggers watched him walk in, pale from adrenaline. "You all right, sir?" Channer just smiled. Never seen a bomber outrun a bullet before. Not every officer approved. One day, a group captain spotted Banks under the cowling of another Mosquito. He didn't like the look of the setup. The tools too specific. The changes too subtle. "You following the specs, Sergeant?" Banks didn't look up. Mostly. He wiped his hands, turned to face the officer. "The aircraft is operational. She'll fly. She'll live." That wasn't the question. It's the only answer that matters. The officer glared, but he didn't stop him. By then, survival rates were talking louder than regulations. No one liked paperwork more than coming home in one piece. But it wasn't magic. These engines were being pushed past what was written on any drawing board. Banks knew it. He checked temperatures obsessively, pulled engines at 150 hours, long before standard overhauls. Sometimes too early, sometimes just in time. Then came the one he missed. A Mosquito, engine 147 hours old, took off for a simple training sortie. At 400 feet, the Port Merlin coughed. A rod snapped. Oil sprayed. The engine caught fire before the pilot could blink. They limped it back around. Landed one engine, nose down, fire still licking the wing. Crew survived. The engine was scrap. Banks tore it down himself. A fatigue crack in the connecting rod. Could have been spotted. Should have been. He didn't speak for a full day. That night, he wrote out a list. Serial numbers, hours flown, who'd worked on what, when. Every modified engine got a line. It became the Bible of the unofficial shop. From then on, no engine passed 150 hours. Period. By summer, the results were undeniable. Loss rates of the modified Mosquitoes were half that of the standard birds. RAF Command didn't ask too many questions. They just moved crews to Marham, quietly, but clearly. The joke in the mess was that the Germans had a new code word for failure. Banksy's been here. And Rodrik Banks, the quiet man in the hangar, just kept turning his spanners, watching his engines take the sky. It was the summer of 1943, and by now, the myth of the Banks engines had crossed more than just squadron lines. It was moving like smoke through every Mosquito wing in Bomber Command. Pilots whispered about it. Some thought it was nonsense. Others swore by it. But the results? Those spoke louder than anyone's doubt. When Squadron Leader Ian McRitty arrived at Marham, fresh from a tour with 139 Squadron, he brought with him a reputation for flying fast and talking fast. First thing he asked when shown to his aircraft was, "Has Banks breathed on this one yet?" A few ground crew chuckled. "Not yet." "Well then," McRitty said, rolling his shoulders, "let's not waste time pretending I want it stock." Banks was selective now. He had to be. Not every engine deserved the boost. Not every pilot could handle it. There was a cost to pushing the Merlins beyond what Rolls-Royce had signed off for. He sat McRitty down that evening by the open hangar doors. The air smelled like warm oil and metal. A Mosquito flew overhead in silhouette, the setting sun burning orange behind its wings. "You want her fast?" Banks said. "You fly her clean." McRitty nodded. "I don't ride the throttles unless I need to." "You keep your temps below red. Always. You get 30, maybe 50 hours before she eats herself. You ditch your ego before you ditch the plane." McRitty gave a small grin. "Understood, Sergeant." Then, after a pause, "Appreciate what you're doing." Banks didn't respond. He never did when someone said thank you. It wasn't about that. By July, the combat reports were becoming impossible to ignore. June 17th, McRitty outruns 3 109s over Hamburg. July 3rd, a Mosquito evades ace Kurt Bulligan, who downed over 100 Allied aircraft. August 22nd, a bird limps home on one modified Merlin, after flak chews up the other. Still outruns pursuit. The stories were piling up, and not in the usual way. These weren't close escapes or lucky breaks. These were physics. Proof. And the Luftwaffe knew something was wrong. The Germans had started adapting. Some FW-190 units received orders to climb higher, dive sooner, cut the intercept window tighter. Their ground stations began calculating Mosquito speeds that, on paper, were impossible. One Luftwaffe intel report, recovered after the war, put it bluntly. The enemy has a new speed capability, possibly engine overboosting, catches reduced, pilot morale affected. That was an understatement. Inside the RAF, things were changing too. Banks wasn't just a rogue mechanic anymore. He was a quiet institution. Engineers from other stations began visiting Marham for routine collaboration. Always the same pattern. They'd show up with a file folder and leave with a head full of ideas they'd never admit to in official reports. Banks, for his part, never wrote anything down beyond his black notebook. He still picked fitters by instinct, still chose which engines to modify by hand, with a mechanic's gut and a mathematician's brain. One of those fitters was Corporal James Dennison. Younger than the rest, sharp-eyed and curious. He asked the right questions. Banks noticed. "You want to do this properly?" Banks said one night, leaning over a stripped-down carburetor. Dennison nodded. "More than anything. Then learn why, not just how." That became the rule. Anyone could copy what Banks did. But if you didn't understand the limits, the temperatures, the fuel burn, the margin between speed and seizure, you'd kill men. Dennison learned quick. By autumn, he was running his own quiet setup at RAF Marham, feeding mosquitoes heading to France. Then came Operation Jericho, a mission too insane to be real. Fly into occupied France, bomb the prison walls in daylight, free the French resistance members marked for execution by the Gestapo. Every pilot knew it was a death run. The walls had to be breached, not flattened. The bombs had to be dropped at rooftop height. That meant slow, level flight under heavy flak. Group Captain Percy Pickard assembled the crews himself. The best, the calm, the lucky, and they all wanted one thing before takeoff: Banks's touch. In the week before the mission, Banks and his small team didn't sleep more than 4 hours at a time. They modified 12 aircraft. Some needed full recalibration. Others had already run close to their hour limits. Banks signed off only the engines he believed in. Pickard's aircraft, unfortunately, was not one of them. That choice would haunt Banks forever. February 18, 1944, the day of the raid. 19 Mosquitoes thundered low across the channel. They hit the target with terrifying precision. Walls shattered, guards scattered. Prisoners fled into the chaos. But the retreat was blood and smoke. German radar had seen them. FW-190s scrambled like wasps from the nearest nests. Pickard's aircraft was caught near Beauvais. No chance to outrun, no cover to hide behind. 2 fighters tore it apart in seconds. 2 more Mosquitoes were lost that day. But 16 made it home. All of them modified. All of them Banks machines. News of Operation Jericho spread like fire through every Allied airfield across Britain. Not because it had worked, though it had. Not because 250 under 238 prisoners had escaped, though they did. Not even because the Mosquito had pulled off a miracle under open sky. It was who didn't come back. Group Captain Percy Pickard, the face of the RAF to many. The man who'd once flown into Oslo at rooftop height. Gone. Rodrik Banks didn't say a word when he heard. He just walked into Workshop 3, shut the door, and pulled down the blinds. For 3 hours, no one disturbed him. When he finally came out, his hands were steady. His jaw was set. "We're pulling any engine past 140 hours from now on," he told Yardley, sharp and clear. "Not 150. I want margins tight." Yardley nodded. He'd been the one to log Pickard's last engine inspection. Even though it wasn't a Banks-modified bird, the loss hit hard. Banks continued, more to himself than anyone. "If I had bent just a little more, if we'd risked one more tweak, maybe." Then he stopped, took a breath. No guessing, not with people's lives. From that day forward, Banks's operation, still unofficial, still denied by command, became something between sacred and surgical. There were rules now, carved from blood and guilt. Modified engines would never fly beyond their limit, even if they seemed healthy. Engines got tagged, logged, tracked like gold. Every crew received a private briefing before flying with one. If you couldn't understand what you were flying, you didn't get it. More stations began requesting modifications. Some sent coded messages, others just sent bottles, the old way of saying, "We need you." Banks couldn't keep up, so he started building something bigger than himself. He trained 6 men directly. Then those 6 trained 6 more. By April 1944, there were close to 40 fitters across Bomber Command quietly performing Banks's miracle. Some specialized. Denison tuned for low-level strike aircraft. The Mosquitoes hunting shipping in the Channel. Yardley focused on high-altitude recon birds. Each had their method, their version of the touch, but all followed the rules. Understand it before you copy it. Push just enough, never too far. Speed saves lives. But speed kills engines. They called themselves the Quiet 40. Never in writing. Never allowed. But they all knew who was in, who had the knowledge, who carried the risk. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe was unraveling. Göring was furious. In a now infamous meeting at Karrenhall, he slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "They're flying wooden furniture over Berlin, and our best fighters can't catch them." The humiliation was personal now. Mosquitoes weren't just bombing. They were photographing the Reichstag in daylight. They were mocking everything the Luftwaffe claimed to be. German engineers scrambled for answers. They pushed the DB-605 engines in their Bf-109s to limits their metallurgy couldn't handle. Pistons cracked. Bearings seized. Entire fighter squadrons were grounded with engine failures. They tried methanol water injection, overboost hex, emergency tuning, but their parts were no longer reliable. Their factories bombed, their materials poor, their assembly lines manned by slave labor who didn't care if a piston was a hair too wide. One 109 pilot wrote in his diary after chasing a mosquito, "It's like hunting a shadow with a pitchfork. She grows wings when I push. Then I smell oil and hear something snap." By May, the evidence was everywhere. Mosquito squadrons running Banks mods had lower loss rates, better strike results, and, crucially, morale. Crews fought to fly them. Commanders fought to get them. But the cost was showing, too. Banks had known it would. By June, 2 more engine failures forced emergency landings. In one, a connecting rod tore straight through the crankcase. The crew survived, but only just. Banks ran his finger over the fractured metal and muttered, "I pulled this engine at 146 hours. Should have done it at 140. My fault." He looked older now, grayer. His hands moved just as fast, but his eyes carried the weight of every decision. Then came the numbers. From June 1944 to March 1945, modified Mosquitoes flew 3,400 sorties. Lost to combat, 11 aircraft. Lost due to mechanical failure, 3. Total crew deaths from engine failure, 3 men, compared to standard Mosquitoes on similar missions, 800 sorties, 47 losses. Loss rate, 0.76%, modified rate, 0.33%. Banks didn't celebrate. He just circled the number, underlined it, quietly whispered, "Worth it." He wasn't building engines anymore. He was building time. Time in the air. Time to finish the job. Time for men to come home. And that, more than any medal or mention, was enough. More than any medal or mention was enough. Your work has pushed the Merlin further than we imagined it could safely go. Consider this an open invitation. We'd be proud to have you in our experimental division after the war. Banks didn't say much when he read it, but Yardley found the letter later, tucked neatly between the pages of Banks's tracking book, pressed like a medal. And still, the missions continued. Berlin, Kiel, Hanover, Hamburg. The Mosquitoes, running hot, screaming fast, darting past enemy fighters like phantoms. Crews still came home pale, shaking, but alive. And the engines, the ones that should have torn themselves apart, just kept roaring. Because Rodrik Banks had made them dance. The war was winding down, but the skies didn't feel any safer. If anything, they felt more desperate, more frantic. Germany was bleeding, but it still had claws. Every mission now had a finality to it. Crews flew like men who knew the finish line was somewhere just over the horizon, but the bullets hadn't stopped. Neither had the flak. And for Rodrik Banks, the engines hadn't stopped either. If anything, the workload increased. Because now, everyone wanted the modifications. No more whispering in hangars. No more backdoor requests over tea mugs. Engineering officers were sending official memos. Request application of TB-184 modifications to Merlin batch RM-492. Priority adjustment to boost control per new bulletin guidelines. The secret was out. The system had bent so long it had finally snapped and reformed itself around Banks's work. But Banks didn't trust it. "Just because they wrote it down," he muttered to Dennison. "Doesn't mean they understand it," Dennison nodded. He'd seen it firsthand. A new generation of fitters applying the bulletin like a recipe book, not a science. They didn't feel the engine. They didn't listen to it. They didn't respect what it was doing inside those cylinders, so Banks doubled down. He called in Yardley, Dennison, and 3 others. They met in Workshop 3, just like the early days. Banks stood by the blackboard with chalk in hand. "No more guessing. No more assumptions. We're going to write down everything we've learned. Every tolerance, every test, every failure." The others listened quietly. "This engine has kept our boys alive for 5 years. We owe her the truth, not just the ministry version." So they built a second book, the real book, not the glossy one from Rolls-Royce, not the cleaned-up bulletin. Banks's book. It held the blood and guts of the Merlin. When to ignore a perfect compression reading. What a cracked exhaust valve smells like under load. How to judge if a crank bearing is within spec, but still dangerous. What detonation really sounds like when you're 5 minutes from the French coast with flak. Bursting at your tail, it was a guide not just to modifying the engine, but to surviving it. The crews noticed the difference, too. They called the modified birds whistlers, because something about the boost, the way the Merlin screamed at altitude, gave off a harmonic you didn't hear in standard engines. It wasn't louder, just sharper, like a blade. Pilots would land, climb down and say things like, "She sang today." Or, sometimes, "She didn't sound quite right. Tell Banks," and he would listen. Every single time. In April, Flight Lieutenant Colin Harrow returned from a daylight bombing run over the Ruhr, shaken and wide-eyed. "She held together," he said. God, she held. But just barely. They found the starboard Merlin running hot. Oil pressure had dipped dangerously low during the egress. Banks tore it apart personally. Found microscopic cracks starting to snake through the cylinder wall. Stress fractures. Early signs. It hadn't failed yet, but it would have. He ran a thumb along the fracture, then pulled the engine from service without a second thought. Later that night, Harrow came to the workshop with a bottle of scotch. He placed it on the table, didn't say a word, and left. Banks didn't touch the bottle. He just sat beside it and stared. As the days wore on, the Mosquito squadrons flew mission after mission with engines tuned to dance on the edge of mechanical failure. And didn't fail. Not often? Not like before. In the last 2 months of the war, modified Merlins flew more than 2,100 sorties. They lost only 9 aircraft and just 2 to mechanical failure. The odds had flipped. The numbers didn't lie, but even now Banks didn't take it as victory. One morning in May, he found Yardley sitting outside the hangar, head in hands. "You all right?" Yardley looked up, red-eyed. "Just tired, Rod. Tired of making bets." Banks sat beside him. "You think we were wrong to do it?" Yardley shrugged. "I think we saved a lot of men." Then, after a long pause, he added, "But I think we burned through a lot of ourselves doing it." Banks looked out at the rows of mosquitoes on the airfield. Quiet now, sleeping in the morning fog. "I'll take that trade," he said softly. And then, one crisp morning in early May, it was over. The war in Europe ended. V-Day. Church bells rang. Airfields erupted in cheers. Ground crews drank from canteens like they'd been waiting to breathe. But in Workshop 3, Banks didn't cheer. He sat alone with the black notebook, flipping through every line. Every engine, every hour, every modification, every name, a quiet reckoning. Later that day, a senior RAF officer handed him a formal letter. Promotion to warrant officer. Citation: exceptional technical contributions to operational effectiveness. Banks read the line twice, then folded the letter and put it in a drawer. Never mentioned it again, because medals didn't matter. What mattered were the names he didn't have to write in red ink. After the war, the noise faded. The skies, once alive with Merlins roaring over the channel, fell silent. The bombers were grounded, the runways emptied. The urgency of survival was replaced with the soft confusion of peace. Rodrik Banks walked the perimeter of RAF Marham one last time in September 1945. The same perimeter he'd marched past as a young fitter, wrench in hand, when the Mosquito was just a wooden oddity no one believed in. He'd aged a decade in 3 years. His hands still bore the faint smell of fuel. His boots were still stained with oil. But his war was over, and so he packed his things: a small duffel bag, a single black notebook, and one worn copy of the Merlin specifications with his penciled annotations tucked inside, and turned in his service cap. The RAF thanked him with an honorable discharge and a letter from Rolls-Royce, offering him a post-war job. Experimental, Division, Derby. They didn't want medals. They wanted his mind. He accepted. Quietly, of course. The world moved on. The Mosquito was retired. Some were scrapped. Some were stored. 1 or 2 made it to museums, their sleek wooden fuselages polished like history's favorite toy. But none carried Banks's modifications anymore. None roared the way his birds had. None remembered the hands that had pushed them past what anyone thought was possible. Workshop 3 was torn down in 1962. Modernization, they said. Nothing marked the ground where DZ-414 once stood. No plaque, no statue. Just fading grass. Rodrik Banks never told his children what he did in the war. He spent 47 years at Rolls-Royce, working on engines for commercial aircraft, helping refine the later generations of turbine design. His name appeared on a few patents, usually buried somewhere in the middle, listed as technical advisor. He never asked for more. He wasn't the kind of man who needed a spotlight. He just wanted things to run right, to fly straight, to last. He died in 1992, at the age of 76, in a quiet house outside Derby, surrounded by family who remembered him as kind, careful, and always a little grease-stained. His obituary in the Derby Telegraph read, "Distinguished career in aerospace engineering. Contributed to post-war aviation innovation. Survived by his wife and 2 sons." Not a single word about Mosquitoes or Merlin engines. Nothing about Operation Jericho. Nothing about the pilots who'd lived because of him. About the pilots who'd lived because of him. But history has a funny way of resurfacing the truth. In 1995, at a Mosquito veterans reunion, 3 old pilots, gray-haired, medals polished, stories still sharp, started talking about Banks's engines. A historian overheard. "Banks?" he asked. "Who was Banks?" And that simple question cracked the seal. It started with a phone call, then a visit to the archives, then squadron's records, engine logs, maintenance reports, letters, whispered memories. And slowly, the story emerged. A sergeant who rewrote the rules without permission. A workshop that turned aircraft into ghosts. A man who ignored manuals to save lives. A legend that existed only in the margins. In ink, in torque, in silence. What became clear wasn't just that Banks had made the Mosquito better. He'd made it faster, deadlier, more survivable than any wooden aircraft had the right to be. He didn't redesign it. He understood it. He saw the space between safe and necessary, and walked the line so others could fly above it. Today, aviation students still study the Mosquito. They marvel at its design, its versatility, its impossible performance, but some, the sharp ones, Ask questions about the numbers that don't add up. Why did some mosquitoes fly faster than the specks? How did they evade fighters that were, on paper, superior? Why do the logs show lower loss rates for certain aircraft? And if you dig deep enough, in just the right places, someone will whisper the answer. That was Banks. He bent the engine so it wouldn't break the pilot. In a museum in Duxford, one of the few surviving mosquitoes sits under glass. On a plaque nearby, a small, unassuming line was added in 2007. This aircraft represents the type flown in operations modified by RAF ground engineers, whose unofficial adjustments contributed to survival rates significantly above standard. No name. But it doesn't need one, because anyone who knows the real story knows exactly who that line belongs to. And if you stand beside that mosquito, when no one else is around, and listen close, you might still hear the faint whistle of a Merlin overboosted by a man who never asked permission, but always knew exactly what he was doing.